Hello, everyone. Recently, I've been re-listening to the Modern Scholar series, Feminism and the Future of Women, taught by Professor Estelle Freedman, a founder of Harvard University's Feminist Studies program, in order to get an example of a mainstream feminist perspective, in contrast to the more radical or revolutionary feminist perspective I've exposed myself to while reading Visibly Female and other feminist art theory and art historical criticism. Unfortunately, this mainstream Feminism 101 class is somewhat dull compared to the more firebrand feminist works, but as I re-listened to Freedman's first lecture, I used a thought experiment which made it much more interesting to listen to, and I think this thought experiment might be a useful way to think about a cultural phenomenon which has occurred in the years since this lecture series was first published in 2004, the rise of anti-feminism, men's rights activists, and other groups like MGTOWs in significant numbers. I'm sure most of the people who fall under any of these labels were alive in 2004, but just speaking personally, I only became aware of them in the last few years, and I think one significant reason why is quite obvious. In 2005, one short year after this lecture series was published, YouTube was founded, and in the years since, these various individuals and groups have had an opportunity to publish their opinions and arguments and have them heard by many people, anyone with access to the internet. My thought experiment asks us to imagine if, instead of being published in 2004, what if we brought Freedman's classroom into the future through a time machine and asked her to teach the exact same class with additional students from today? As we will see, some of Freedman's words from 2004 look quite different today when we look back on them. But if we imagine ourselves as students in her class, I think we can gain a lot of insight into what's changed since 2004 and why it has changed. Now, you could simply imagine yourself in the class, but for this thought experiment to work best, I want you first to imagine yourself as a young student who is very sympathetic to feminism, reads feminist blogs like the Mary Sue, watches pro-feminist YouTube videos, browses Tumblr. Second, imagine yourself as a young student who is at least somewhat sympathetic to men's rights activism. The second student could have just heard a little bit about men's rights activists and even be casually sympathetic to some of the arguments they've heard. I haven't identified the sex of either of these students, but I would prefer you to imagine this second student as a young man. Sure, the feminist student could be a male feminist, and the MRA student could be a girl who listens to Honey Badger Radio and is an outspoken proponent of men's rights. But part of my whole point in doing this exercise is I want us to try and identify with a young man entering a college classroom teaching feminist theory. So because of that, I'm imagining the MRA sympathizer as a young man. To make it even simpler, I want to give this young man just one issue that he's particularly concerned about, because you could have any range of perspectives under the umbrella of anti-feminist. And MRAs and MGTOWs, that could describe any number of key topics. It could describe a whole bunch of positions. The one issue that this young man is most concerned about is male war fatalities. He knows that a disproportionate percentage of combat deaths are men, nearing 100%. Like I said, he does not have to identify himself under any label or be politically involved. His interest in these topics could be completely casual. But I think imagining ourselves as these two students will help anyone, particularly feminists, who cannot believe the amount of pushback feminism receives in current year. It'll help them be able to see why the sort of arguments we see today, these had to happen. If you have a friend or a family member who is a feminist or a progressive, and you think my discussion of this lecture is helpful, I would deeply appreciate if you would subscribe and share this video, because I do have a progressive or feminist person in mind while I'm writing this. If we do not try to empathize with the type of young male student I am describing, we are setting ourselves up for all sorts of problems in the future. In other words, if you are a feminist, if you are on the left, I think it is in your interest to think about this perspective. I'm going to go ahead and imagine our feminist student as a girl, just to add a little bit of personal stake for both of them in this conversation. Just for fun, I also tried to imagine a third student who was sort of the typical slacker who took this class just because it let him sleep in. But in contrast, I'm imagining both of these students as thoughtful young people who are very engaged in the class. These are not lazy students. My goal in this video isn't to thoroughly summarize every point made by Freedman. If I wanted to do that, I may revisit Freedman in the future and look at her book, which was used as the primary assigned reading for this college class. In other words, the book is good for depth, but the course is good for the basics. I will be summarizing some of her main points in the first lecture. What is feminism? But this isn't only about summarizing it. I've structured this video so that it's possible for you to understand what I'm talking about without immediately listening to the lecture series. But of course, I'd strongly encourage you to listen to the original lecture to obtain more context, and I'll indicate when I'm quoting Freedman directly. This series is available from recorded books and listening services like Audible. After the introductory material introducing the topic and the teacher, Freedman describes her class as Feminism 101 and asks us to suspend any preconceptions we may have about feminism. Later in the lecture, we learn that she is particularly concerned about negative portrayals of feminism in the mainstream media. Freedman wants her class to look at feminism from a historical perspective, ask how the term got to be so politically loaded, in her words, and consider what feminism means for the future of women, as the title for this lecture series suggests. Freedman says that we can observe changes in society in the past century as clear examples of feminism's effect on the culture. These range from the meaning of the word gender to the structure of the family to the percentage of professional women in the workforce. As an example of feminism promoting the interests of men, Freedman mentions a court case involving a New Jersey state trooper who sued for his right to take paid parental leave. Now remember our thought experiment? So far, the young lady who is casually sympathetic to feminism and the young man who is casually sympathetic to MRA arguments haven't heard anything about feminism, which is particularly controversial. Of course, feminism has had an effect on our culture over the decades. But the mention of men receiving paid parental leave catches the attention of the young man. Does this mean that feminism is interested in promoting his ability to enjoy a benefit that previously he could have been denied because of his sex? He's very interested. Freedman continues listing examples of feminism's influence on the world. She asserts that while women in Afghanistan not being allowed to leave the home unaccompanied by a man was a topic of wide conversation in America in the early 2000s, restrictions on women leaving the home was once the norm around the world. Freedman explains that the goal of her class is to give a historical backdrop to these societal issues, treating the 150-year history of feminism as the lens through which she wants us to look at these topics. In Freedman's words, the general goal of feminism is insisting on the same political and economic choices available to most men. Freedman sees feminism as what has allowed women to move into full citizenship, politically and economically, and according to Freedman, the reason feminism is relevant to these changes is that it questions any subordination based on sex. The feminist student nods and continues taking notes. Nothing she has heard is particularly objectionable. Maybe she takes mild offense at Afghanistan being used as an example of the oppression of women because it may promote Islamophobia, or maybe she doesn't. But for the young man, things are different. Remember, this young man is particularly concerned about personally dying in war. He knows that, in the event there is a major war, his registering for selective service means there is a strong possibility he could be conscripted in a major world conflict. As he's been listening to Freedman's lectures, he's keenly interested. He may agree fully with everything Professor Freedman has said up to this point. He might agree that women have gained full citizenship thanks to feminism in the past century, and at the words that feminism wants to question any subordination based on sex, he may be anticipating that feminism might be very good for him if it questions the conscription of young men based on sex. As he listens, Professor Freedman begins to make her historical argument on why feminism has become critical today. Quote, "For much of human history, gender hierarchy was taken for granted, that men should have authority over women, that only at a particular point in history did a critique of patriarchy or men's rule in the family appear. And that appeared a couple hundred years ago for two major historical reasons. One, the rise of democratic political theory, and two, the wage labor systems and the market economies that transformed the world economic system. The feminist student continues taking notes attentively. Nothing too outlandish here. Feminism critiques patriarchy and the male rule of the family, of course. But the young man is still waiting, and what he hears is quite different. Sure, in certain contexts, it might make perfect sense to say that certain men had authority over women as a general rule. I bring home the bacon, I wear the pants in this family, that kind of stuff. He might still be entirely sympathetic to feminism. But why is the nature of the hierarchy explicitly identified as men over women? Aren't there going to be certain aspects of society and history, such as war casualties, where women are privileged over men? The young man waits and listens. Freedman acknowledges that this transformation in the world economic system brought people out of subsistence living and provided men new rights for the first time in history. In other words, Freedman's a good capitalist. She argues that this created a gap. Men achieved these new rights and privileges prior to women. This widening gap in opportunities is what prompted the first feminist critiques. Freedman makes a firm point that feminism is not monolithic. There are many strains of feminisms, plural, and they are never static. These differing feminisms respond to each other and change over time. If the two students are even casually aware of revolutionary feminism, trans-exclusionary radical feminism, pro-life feminism, intersectional feminism, or common disagreements between feminists, they both nod. Yep, political thought and movements are very complicated. Freedman defines some of her key terms: sex and gender. Sex, she says, is for biological categories. Freedman calls sex a biological given. For the first time, our young feminist student snaps up her head from her notes. Did Professor Freedman just insist that there are two biological categories and that this is a given? Is she ignorant of the existence of intersex individuals? Doesn't she recognize the cis-heteronormative nature of this description of biological sex? Unaware of the bubbling inferno, Professor Freedman continues by defining gender as the way society creates meanings around sex, so from male and female to masculine and feminine. Gender as a social construct. Nothing new here. Freedman then introduces what may be a new term, gender systems, which she defines as the roles or social practices that any culture provides as a normative standard. You know, goils were goils and men were men, that kind of stuff. Still somewhat irritated, the young female student nods. She, of course, knows that gender is a social construct. The young man is still thinking. He has lived examples in his own life of being asked to prove he's a man and perform a stunt by his peers. He's seen examples of social norms molding how people behave, of course. But since he's casually interested in YouTube videos critiquing feminism, he notes that there's also a healthy debate over the role of nature versus nurture for a lot of these questions. Do boys do dumb stunts just because their peers in patriarchy pressure them to do dumb stunts? Or could raging hormones provide a genetic explanation for why boys do dumb stunts? Professor Freedman suggests that gender systems can be viewed as part of a continuum, anywhere from one extreme to another. The first extreme, a gender hierarchy or a patriarchy. For example, the Taliban in Afghanistan. Freedman notes that patriarchy is a hierarchy that tends to exist alongside other hierarchies, like religion, race, or class. The second extreme is what Freedman calls an egalitarian gender system. While the feminist student is still chewing her lip over a Muslim country, again being singled out as an example of patriarchy, the young man hears the word egalitarian and has a positive connection with the term. He thinks of himself as an egalitarian. He wants all people to have equality before the law and equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcome. It sounds like feminism is supportive of free societies where justice is blind to things like sex and race. He continues listening attentively. Friedman then provides an example of a society between the two extremes of patriarchy and egalitarianism, gender parallelism, a society where men do certain things, women do certain things, but they're valued equally. It's important to note here that feminism, under Freedman's definition, is opposed to gender parallelism and seeks to move society towards what she calls gender egalitarianism. These are the three possible gender systems Freedman mentions, but she adds a fourth as a kind of theoretical possibility: the inverse of patriarchy, a matriarchy with women over men. Freedman says of matriarchy, there is very little historical evidence that there has ever been widespread matriarchy. The feminist student nods enthusiastically. She, of course, has put some right-wing trolls in their place for suggesting that women enjoy privilege over men. To her, the non-existence of matriarchy is self-evident. Maybe she was a little hurt to discover that Wonder Woman's Amazons weren't actually a part of real history, but it makes sense to her that the lack of historical evidence for a real matriarchy is a strong argument for feminism's view of privilege. Men tend to dominate political power through history. But the young man's reaction is quite different. What's been a nagging question for him this whole time is becoming more and more nagging. Earlier, feminism was about egalitarianism, but now the concept of a matriarchy is being dismissed, while the concept of a patriarchy is being presented as a reality. He, of course, understands the point that Amazonian societies ruled by women are mostly myths, they're not history. Earlier, he resonated when Professor Freedman said that feminism would seek to grant fathers the same rights to paid parental leave as mothers. But why is there this continuous focus of men over women? He wonders why the example of war casualties wouldn't be completely relevant to Professor Freedman's whole point, assuming that is, that feminism is egalitarian. For now, he pushes these questions aside and waits to hear more examples. According to Freedman, feminism proposes gender egalitarianism and suggests that the term feminism can either be used strictly and historically or more flexibly. So you could describe prominent women as feminists, even if they lived before the term feminism originated in the late 1800s in France. Freedman then makes a very interesting comment about feminism in America around 1910. She says that although early American feminists emphasized equal rights or total equality, the women's suffrage movement emphasized the differences between men and women, like the value of motherhood. Freedman says that not only did most suffragists emphasize this difference, most probably thought that, quote, women were a little better than men. To the feminist student, nothing out of the ordinary has been said. But the young man thinks, a little better than men? What does that mean? If I said men were a little better than women, I'd rightfully be called a bigot. Is Professor Freedman saying the suffragists were gender bigots? But he doesn't get any more detail, so he just tries to concentrate and returns to note-taking. Freedman suggests that feminism really only became a significant American movement under the name feminism in the 1960s. She says, feminism, for me, is a belief that even though women and men are inherently of equal worth, most societies privilege men as a group. She then argues that this gap necessitates social movements and underscores the importance of intersectional privilege. The female student nods, but the male student is confronted. He loves hearing that men and women are of equal worth. He thinks of the conversations where he's been told to check his male privilege, the memes of young women wearing shirts that say, I bathe in male tears, or men are trash. By Professor Freedman's personal definition, this would mean that feminists who demean and diminish the value of men are not worthy of the label of feminism. He thinks this is positively encouraging, but at the same time, he is reminded that every time Professor Freedman discusses privilege, it is privilege for the benefit of men at the expense of women. And every time he hears this, he keeps imagining in his mind's eye what it'd be like to be drafted, to die alone on a battlefield far from home. He keeps wondering this question over and over again. Given the claim that feminism is egalitarian and interested in any gender disparity, why on earth would this class not be discussing any number of men's rights issues entirely relevant to the topic at hand? If men are privileged as a group, why are they the ones sent as a group to die a painful death throughout history? This powerful mental image, not just of some unnamed soldier dying in a battlefield, but of him personally dying in a battlefield, crying for his mother, and his mother not being there for him as he dies, sticks in the young man's mind. It colors everything he hears and thinks about for the rest of the lecture. It is nagging at him. But Professor Freedman and the young feminist student do not have this mental picture on their minds right now. Right now, what they are thinking about is male privilege. Professor Freedman says their course will focus on two major questions. What difference does gender make? Why do gender differences exist? Another way of thinking about the question, are they neutral or do they disadvantage women? The young feminist student dutifully notes these questions. The young man thinks of his death on a battlefield, and he hears an implicit assumption, not directly stated in the last question. If gender differences are neutral or they disadvantage women, that seems to suggest that gender differences do not disadvantage men. He thinks of a bullet wound in his stomach. He imagines the pain of his internal organs spilling onto dusty ground. He imagines the ringing in his ears and the spinning sensation from blood loss. And with every example Professor Freedman provides, the young man becomes less and less neutral and optimistic about the egalitarian nature of feminism, and more annoyed over the nagging, unanswered question, how important is he personally to the political aims of what Professor Freedman describes as feminism? Professor Freedman then cites an example of male privilege. As of 2004, women earned about 10% of the engineering degrees in college, but women also earned about 95% of the library science degrees. She asks, which degree do you think is more highly paid or valued? The feminist student nods and smiles broadly. Excellent. A clear, empirical example of male privilege. Men earn more engineering degrees. Women earn more library science degrees. But engineers are paid significantly more than librarians. How much clearer could it be? Social problems like this, these economic injustices, require feminist political action to address. And yes, a focus of this course is not merely a dry historical description of feminism. By Professor Freedman's admission, they will be discussing feminist strategies for the future of women as a key part of the course. The young woman is looking forward to learning these strategies, not just so that she can have an informed opinion on feminism, but so that she can be a better political activist for feminism. But at the mention of Freedman's argument about male engineers being paid more than female librarians, the young man's annoyance is slowly turning to anger, because he is starting to see a glaring hole in Professor Freedman's mainstream, ostensibly egalitarian feminism. When he hears Professor Freedman using gender disparities between different college degrees, he doesn't just hear a factoid about gender disparity. He hears that in relation to his primal fear about the gender disparity over dying on the battlefield. What is so significant about librarian salaries as compared to engineers' salaries when you are concerned about your death? Both of these students are regular readers. Both are bright young minds. They begin making connections, not just copying down facts. They see some logical implications. Earlier, Freedman identified feminism as a movement which seeks gender egalitarianism as opposed to gender parallelism. And given that she is identifying disparity in students' chosen majors as an example to illustrate male privilege, it follows that feminism, under Freedman's definition, would seek to have about 50% of engineering students be women and 50% of library science students be men. If gender disparity in college degrees illustrates male privilege, and if feminism seeks to redress male privilege, it must follow that feminism would prefer to have this disparity in college degrees eliminated in their ideal society. But what if individual male and female students do not self-organize themselves that way? What if women, given the freedom to choose, simply prefer the work of a librarian over the work of an engineer? So what if an engineer is paid more? What if they simply prefer the work of being around books? Maybe both the young woman and the young man are familiar with the YouTube series, The Factual Feminist by Professor Christina Hoff Sommers, and the idea of choice feminism. If the young women want to be librarians and not engineers, and they freely choose that educational path, there's no deeper implication for choice feminism. It's fine. Be a librarian. You are free to choose. But the broad umbrella feminism Freedman describes instead sees an instance of social privilege, which it wants to equalize. How can you change the choices that individuals make for their career paths? What if there are underlying biological realities that are a contributing factor to these decisions, like a woman's biological clock, which gives a woman who wants children a stricter time limit to either marry or risk having children out of wedlock? Maybe being a librarian is a smarter choice than being an engineer for a woman who just likes books and wants a lighter workload. Does accomplishing social justice mean that we're going to have to exert some sort of external pressure to make more women become engineers and more men librarians? How will this end goal be accomplished precisely? Freedman then discusses the intersectional lens: religion, race, class. She sees all of these as relevant to understanding privilege. For example, African American women had been in the wage labor force for years before white women entered into the labor force. For these black women, work was a necessity, whereas for white women, the opportunity to work was seen as a desirable right. Nearing the end of her lecture, Freedman then clarifies what she thinks feminism is not. These are what she calls preconceptions, which she hopes her students abandon. Feminism is not, in her words, a theory of women's victimization by men, and adds that women have had survival strategies even under extreme patriarchy. Both of the students might scratch their heads at this. Because he's heard the earlier point about intersectionality, the young man may be wondering if this means that there are instances where women are actually privileged over men. Sure, there may be a class dimension to being drafted as a soldier, where poor young men tend to die in war more often than wealthy young men, but he's still pretty dang sure that the biggest predictor is sex, not race nor class. The young feminist has generally seen patriarchy and privilege as a form of victimization of women, restricting her right to abortion, for example. When she hears Professor Freedman say that feminism is not about the victimization of women by men, she might start thinking about resisting the status quo, of patriarchy crushing thigh style memes and Tumblr art. Freedman continues, feminism is not for women only, and discusses the successes of male feminists throughout history. This, more than any other moment, dates this lecture series. In 2004, the term male feminist had nothing but cheerful connotations, but in current year, wrapping things up, Freedman argues that feminism is not a solely Western phenomenon, and reiterates that feminism is never monolithic and never static. When discussing feminism, we are discussing multiple groups and ideas, which may be at conflict with one another. Of note here was that in defining feminism, Freedman chose a definition which claimed egalitarianism and claimed equal value for men and women as human beings. If either student is vaguely familiar with radical feminism, they should be keenly aware of a significant strain of feminist rhetoric which minces no words when it comes to men, expressing vitriol and hate. The young man has seen "men are trash" style memes. Perhaps the young woman has posted such memes. Whether or not they accept Professor Freedman's more moderate, inclusive definition of feminism, their experience on the internet has told them that this strain of rhetoric exists. The young man is inclined to be sympathetic to moderate feminism. He sees these as two perspectives in opposition to one another. He doesn't have a fully informed opinion on feminism, so he's willing to give some feminists the benefit of the doubt until they personally treat him either with respect or with disdain and avarice. The young female student may not see any tension whatsoever between saying that feminism advances the interests of men and her posting angry comments about men on her Twitter or participating in feminist protests against films which discuss men's issues. She may see these as tactics which advance the cause of feminism. It's also possible that she could be a more moderate feminist who has spoken out against male tears memes and told feminists mocking men as basement dwellers to stop. No matter what their opinion on these kill all men type of memes are, however, they both know they exist, and they note the absence of this anti-male vitriol from Freedman's definition of historical feminism. The rest of the lecture is devoted to Freedman laying out a summary of the remaining lectures and discussing the assigned readings. When she reiterates her main thesis at the end, it's another example of how her brand of feminism, when it discusses disparities, only sees disparity as existing at the expense of women and the benefit of men. When she says that since the 1800s, men and women have challenged the notion that one's sex should determine one's legal and economic status, she identifies the women's rights movement as the way this disparity has been addressed, begging the question of what has addressed disparities at the expense of men. This is the glaring hole which has persisted throughout this lecture. This young man in our thought experiment does not need to hate feminism. He can actually feel nothing but good vibes about feminism going into this lecture. But so long as he has seen just a few toxic feminist memes denigrating men, or watched just a couple videos on the topics of men's rights, without taking any formal position, Professor Freedman's lecture will only serve to remind him of a crucial lesson he is going to take with him for the rest of the time he continues learning about feminism. So far, he has heard no acknowledgement of significant male problems, apart from a casual mention of paid parental leave for men, when it seems to him that such acknowledgments would be completely relevant to what Freedman says the ideology of feminism is seeking to accomplish. And as long as he does not hear his fears addressed, as long as he hears feminist theory matter-of-factly describe every gender disparity as privileging men as a group over women as a group, no matter how much intersectional theory is thrown into the feminist soup, no matter how many times a feminist says that of course she cares about how patriarchy hurts men too, what will always haunt him is not what feminists say they want to do, but what they actually go about doing, and also what they leave unsaid. And if the only people he hears talking about his fear of dying on a battlefield is anti-feminist YouTube channels, then not only is he likely to listen to more content like that, he is always going to find more appeal in an argument which acknowledges and seriously addresses problems faced by men over an ideology which refuses to acknowledge or discuss such problems. I said at the beginning of this video that I am thinking about feminists and progressives while I am talking about this idea. So here's the question I want to leave for feminists, progressives, or social justice activist listeners. If you do not think that feminism is cancer, what are you going to do? Not say, not write, not tweet, but do, to convince a generation of young men like the one I've described that feminism is not cancer. Your actions speak louder than words. It's not enough to avoid calling him a garbage human being on the internet. That's the absolute minimum standard of behavior. I'm asking you what your activism is going to do to help this young man. Young people who have no negative opinion of feminism whatsoever are watching you and listening to you. I don't think the matter of whether feminism triumphs or fades is primarily up to anti-feminist YouTubers at this point. I think we are at the point where feminism is working from a position of power, and feminists can either behave so toxically they destroy their own movement, or they can get serious about cutting the cancer out of their movement, if that is even possible. I think what Professor Freedman's lecture shows is that even in more moderate or self-styled egalitarian feminism, feminism still has a problem speaking to young men. With that, I'm affectionately yours, #1 Marmaduke fan. I love you guys, and I'll catch you later.